where we take a look at music, movies, books, and other media that's either out of print, out of reach, incomplete, or has never been released. I'm Lana, and today we're revisiting that mysterious place called Lanulos. On the evening of November the 2nd, 1966, in Mineral Wells, West Virginia, an electronics salesman named Woodrow Derenberger arrived home at the two-story farmhouse he rented. After a long day of schlepping stereos and sewing machines around in his Ford Econo van. It was dark and bitter cold, and Woody, as his friends called him, couldn't quite remember all of his drive home. He was in a state of shock as he traversed the steps of his front porch and stepped inside his house, where he asked his wife, Catherine, to sit down with him at the kitchen table. She could see that Woody was visibly shaken and likely pale from the somewhat unnerving experience he'd had while he was on his way home that evening. And being that it was late and so very dark out, she tried to put together in her mind what might have happened. An early season snowstorm had struck the region around Mineral Wells, and it was raining when Woody was making his way home. The roads were likely to have been icy and treacherous, and since it was very dark out and she had been inside that evening, she might not have seen the state of Woody's van just yet. Woody was a tall, husky man in his 50s, and not the type to be easily intimidated by anyone who might give him a less than warm welcome while he was peddling his electronics from door to door, trying to secure a sale. So, if he had run into some kind of trouble that evening, Catherine thought, it must have been because of the sour weather that was sweeping through the state. It was the kind of weather that should have probably kept him home that day. But Woody had had a long succession of modest jobs, and he had a young wife and 2 children to look after now. He had taken the door-to-door sales job as a temporary measure because the workers at the plant where he'd previously worked were all on strike, and most employers didn't want to take on workers who were on strike and just looking for a temporary fix. Woody wasn't the overly assertive type to be well-suited for sales, but he was the breadwinner of the house, and staying home just because of some less than ideal weather just wasn't an option for him. "Did you have an accident that's killed someone?" Catherine asked hesitantly. Woody assured her that nothing like that had happened, and even though his emotional state was completely wrecked, physically he and his van were both perfectly fine. And just as a wave of relief probably began to wash over Catherine, Woody told her what had happened that night. And the sense of shock that Woody had brought home with him suddenly became contagious, because Catherine was now overcome with the same feeling. The only sensible thing to do, she resolved, was to call the police. Woody agreed and picked up the phone. But he was still visibly shaking, and as he tried to relate the events of the evening over the phone, his voice quivered so much as to make him a little hard to understand. Catherine gently took the phone from him and related Woody's story to the police. When she finished telling a story that, frankly, must have been excruciatingly difficult to tell, the officer on the line told her to hang up and that they'd call her back shortly. Catherine hung up the phone and she and her husband waited. The tension must have been palpable. After 10 minutes that must have felt like an eternity, the phone finally rang. As promised, it was the police, and they asked Catherine if Woody was nervous or frightened, although the state of his voice on the line from before should have been all the answer that they needed. Catherine assured them that Woody was regaining his composure as best he could, and that physically he seemed to be just fine. And although Catherine hadn't expressed any concern over Woody's state of mind, it's possible that some part of her might have worried, because the story he had told her was strange to say the least. And either by presumption or intuition, the police seemed to have picked up on that, because they assured Catherine that she shouldn't be at all concerned, because they'd gotten calls from 2 other people who'd been stopped on the same road by the same man that Woody had met earlier that evening. I'm not sure what time Woody arrived home that evening, but he wouldn't be able to calm down enough to get any sleep until somewhere around 3 a.m. And Catherine was so shaken by the story that she didn't sleep at all. Woody went back to work the next day at 8 o'clock, Woody's boss noticed that he seemed to be distressed, or maybe even excited, and he asked Woody what was wrong. Woody didn't seem like the type to temper his response for the occasion, and in an unapologetically straightforward manner, Woody related his story in vivid detail. His employer laughed at first, thinking that this was all a put-on or a prank, but he soon realized that Woody wasn't joking. The bizarre story Woody told of an even more bizarre foreign man was unnerving. This was the height of the Cold War, and there were 2 Air National Guard bases in West Virginia, Shepherd Field in Martinsburg and McLaughlin Air National Guard Base in Charleston, the latter of which was only about an hour's drive from the site of the incident. And concerns of potential Soviet espionage were rife in the U.S. intelligence community. A producer from WTAP-TV in Parkersburg visited the store where Woody was working, and he asked Woody to make a televised statement of the incident. Wanting to be helpful to the community, Woody agreed, probably not realizing that he'd be the only one to give a recorded account of the event. And when he arrived at the TV station at 2:30, he was met by a sergeant from the state police, and an Air Force sergeant, and some other officials that he didn't know. And they all questioned him for 3.5 hours. And reports of similar incidents on or around Interstate 77, where the event had taken place, were still being reported to the police. Whatever was going on, it seemed as though it wasn't happening just to Woody. But Woody seemed to wear his heart on his sleeve, and he was willing to talk to most anyone who wanted to talk to him. And his good-natured approach to dealing with people would prove to be costly. After Woody arrived home that day, he was met by a crowd of people who wanted to hear his story, and some of them even claimed to have had the same bizarre experience. And, Woody being Woody, he told the story again. Although by this time, I'm sure he was probably sick of telling it. And the small crowd that had amassed at Woody's house remained there until 2:30 in the morning, when he insisted that he had to get some sleep before work the next day. After Woody's television interview aired, the story was picked up by the Associated Press, who spread the story around the world, and Woody's peaceful life was shattered. The phone rang constantly. People called from Texas, New York, California, and letters from all over the world filled his mailbox. And strangers began to arrive in droves at the Derenberger home, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bizarre stranger that Woody had met on November the 2nd. Catherine was understandably unnerved by the crowds that gathered in their front yard. Anywhere from 5 to 30 people could be seen loitering outside each night, with no respect for the late hours at which they showed up. In an age in which being neighborly and accommodating still had some value, the Derenbergers tried to make the best of it, often serving cookies and gallons of coffee to strangers until 3 or 4 a.m. These were just overly excited, curious people, the Derenbergers told themselves. But things soon got out of hand. Woody came home one night to see cars parked alongside the road as far as the eye could see, and men sat perched in the neighborhood's trees, holding shotguns in hopes of finding fame for being the ones to nab the mysterious stranger from Woody's story, who had apparently been named West Virginia's new menace. Woody had had enough. He called the police, who of course responded by clearing out the looky-loos from the neighborhood. But as soon as the patrol car had left, strangers began pouring back into Woody's neighborhood once again. Woody's 3-year-old daughter, Tanya, couldn't sleep at night because she was afraid of the strange voices that had amassed outside of her bedroom window. And sometimes she would wake up shrieking in the night. And the Derenberger's son Charles had begun to have his own troubles with bullies at school. The phone continued to ring constantly, and even after Woody had had their phone number changed to an unlisted number, it kept ringing. Some callers issued threats and warned him to keep quiet. Others consisted of nothing more than eerie electronic sounds and code-like beeps, which was an odd occurrence that wasn't as uncommon as you might think in West Virginia in 1966. And the Derenbergers' troubles didn't end there. Woody was now recognized wherever he went. As a salesman on commission, his earnings rapidly decreased until his work slowed to a standstill. People would call him expressing interest in a sewing machine or a stereo. And after Woody had driven considerable distances, sometimes 40 miles or more, he would find the sales call to be no more than a ruse, meant to draw him into someone's home to talk to them about the stranger he'd met on Interstate 77. The Derenbergers began to live off of their savings while they waited for the storm of public interest to die down. But as their savings began to dwindle further and further down, they realized that they couldn't wait any longer. Feeling as though they had no other alternative, the Derenbergers left their house and moved into a summer home owned by Catherine's parents near the Little Kanawha River. But after a month or so of peace, curious people began to show up at the Derenbergers' new home. Bizarre rumors began to spread about the family, and soon the crowds outside of Woody's home became too big for him to continue his work. The family moved again to Vienna, West Virginia, where they were visited by a film crew from Germany who wanted to make a documentary about Woody's story. For Catherine, this was the last straw, and she left Woody, taking the children along with her on her move to Cleveland, Ohio, far from the insanity that Woody had unintentionally brought into their lives. Woody relocated to Cleveland soon afterward and tried to mend bridges, but by 1970, the couple had divorced. Night after night, their family had been harassed by invasive opportunists, hell-bent on seeing, and in some instances shooting, the mysterious stranger that Derenberger had met on November the 2nd of 1966. And, in a cruel twist of irony, the mysterious stranger had made an appearance on Woody's lawn, amidst a crowd of strangers who couldn't have been more oblivious to his presence. He was said to have been just under 6 feet tall, weighed somewhere around 180 pounds, and he had thick, dark hair that he combed straight back. And he's said to have had a tanned complexion, and looked to be somewhere between 35 to 40 years old. Now, Woody obviously bared the man no resentment at all, because he could have easily alerted the crowd, some of whom were armed, to the man's presence. But instead, he talked casually with the man who had all but destroyed his life. And Woody told him that his stomach was really bothering him. He had likely developed an ulcer from the relentless stress that the media blitz and the endless flow of strangers onto his property had caused him. And it just so happened that the man had a vial of medicine that he presented to Woody before he got back into his Volkswagen and disappeared down the road. Now, I don't know how many people Woody related his story to in all those years, but the one that's definitely the most well-known today was a journalist from New York named John Keel, who arrived in West Virginia on a stormy night in November of 1967, almost exactly 1 year to the day when Woody had had his fated meeting, and 1 month before the Silver Bridge, which spanned the Ohio River between Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Kanawha, Ohio, collapsed, resulting in the deaths of 46 people, a night on which some locals claimed that the devil himself walked down the rain-soaked streets of West Virginia. The reasons behind disasters aren't always immediately apparent to us. In 1967, no one could have predicted that Christmas parties would be replaced by funerals after the collapse of the Silver Bridge. Of course, by 1971, it had been determined that the bridge collapse was caused by stress corrosion cracking in a steel eye-bar that was a crucial link in the North suspension chain on the Ohio side of the bridge. But in 1967, stories of the supernatural weighed heavily on people's minds, and there were those who would give in to false cause fallacies to explain away the tragedy. It might sound ridiculous now, but during World War II, mechanical failures were often blamed on small, impish supernatural saboteurs called gremlins, a myth that's said to have been popularized by the Royal Air Force. It allowed mechanics to save some face, and also alleviate, in part, some of the fears everyone had of real saboteurs. Gremlins weren't on either side of the war. They were just mischievous parts of an unseen world that we all had to accept. And even though the so-called mischievous supernatural forces that were said to be at work in West Virginia in the 1960s were no less deadly, they weren't seen as at all impish or remotely cute. In fact, on a stormy night in November of 1966, some locals believed that the devil himself was wandering the rain-soaked streets and knocking on the doors of frightened residents. At 3 a.m. on a dilapidated residential street, where some houses were unpainted and beginning to show signs of decay, a strange figure walked up to the door of a crumbling farmhouse and began to knock. Okay, let's stop there for a moment. Now, I know what you're thinking. I haven't even told you about Woodrow Derenberger's first meeting with the strange man on the road that everybody freaked out over, or the story of the Silver Bridge. And now we're launching into a totally different story? Talk about burying the lead. Aren't you taking this just a little too far? And, I get that. But before we dive into Derenberger's story further, and the lost edition of his book that's the subject of this podcast, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for all of this. Because, as with all stories, perspective is, well, everything. So just hang tight with me, okay? Now, where were we? Oh yeah, devil visits West Virginia. Mysterious figure knocking on farmhouse door. That's right. Anyway, after a few minutes, a light blinked on inside, and a young woman answered, drawing a cheap dressing gown tightly around herself as she opened the front door just a crack. Strangers were rare and suspect in the tightly knit community, and unannounced visitors in the dead of night were unheard of. A few brief flashes of lightning illuminated the porch for the briefest of moments, and the woman caught a glimpse of the mysterious figure. He was said to be 6 feet tall and had a goatee. He wore a black suit, had a black tie, and a black hat, and he was wearing an overcoat that, you guessed it, was black. But instead of standing on cloven hooves, he wore black dress shoes that were soaked in rain and caked in mud. "May I use your phone?" the man asked in a deep, gravelly voice. "My husband," the woman replied. "Talk to my husband." She closed the door quickly and returned with a young man. Once again, they opened the door just enough to look out onto the stranger on their doorstep through the narrowest of cracks. And the young man who now stood beside the woman turned pale as he looked at the stranger on their doorstep. "We ain't got no phone here," the man said sternly before slamming the door in the bearded stranger's face. Bearded men were rare in rural communities in West Virginia in the 1960s, as were business suits worn outside of church. The figure's height and serious demeanor had given him an otherworldly appearance to the couple, almost as if he'd been some kind of wandering spirit. In the days that followed, the couple told their friends about the figure that had unexpectedly appeared on their doorstep. He seemed to have struck them as imposing, and some people within the religious community began to suspect that it was an omen of some kind. Was this the same man that Derenberger met on Interstate 77? No, not by a long shot. The late-night knocker was just a little too tall, if only by an inch or two, and the rest of his description didn't match either. But, as fate would have it, the appearance of the man dressed in black would end up being just as memorable to the residents of Parkersburg in the months to come, and even more so to the friends and family of the anonymous farmhouse residents who had opened their door that night to see what the stranger wanted. Because 3 weeks later, the couple tragically died on December the 15th of 1967 at 4:58 p.m. while they were driving across the Silver Bridge when, without warning, the Silver Bridge collapsed. At the time of the disaster, the bridge was packed with rush hour and holiday season traffic. The tragic loss of so many friends, family members, and neighbors left people searching for answers. How could something like this have happened? And why didn't we see it coming? Who could be to blame for all of this? And it was this train of thought that likely led friends of the now anonymous farmhouse couple to remember the story of the black shadowy figure that had alighted on their doorstep just 3 weeks earlier, asking to be let inside like a vampire in Salem's Lot. And, as the story goes, other people had encountered the same figure, knocking relentlessly and asking to be let inside. Could it have been some terrible omen? Could it have been the devil himself? Now, I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to you that it wasn't the devil. It was just a very cold and wet journalist from New York named John Keel, who famously said that he preferred to think that he did not, in fact, look like the devil, whatever that looks like. He had run his car off the rain-soaked road and was just looking for a phone so that he could call a tow truck. Waiting for him in the car was Mary Heyer, the star reporter from the Athens, Ohio Messenger, which was a popular newspaper in the area. But the sleepy farming community didn't know anything about reporters or how different men's fashion was in New York. So they explained Keel's presence the only way they knew how, through religion. Okay, let's stop there for just a second. I know what you're probably thinking. The farmhouse couple mistook the mundane for the fantastic, and now you're going to tell me that Woody did the exact same thing. And then you're going to give me a preachy treatise on how culture dictates how we interpret the world around us. Well, I can't really say about Woody, but you're right about the treatise part. It does go without saying that your preconceived notions of reality and your belief in the supernatural really shape the way you see the world. Obviously, the devil did not visit West Virginia on a rainy night in 1967, and gremlins weren't maliciously tinkering with engines in World War II, but people certainly experience things that they can't identify. And I do think that people interpret unusual things in the only ways that they know how. As John Keel pointed out, if you had been a European who saw a strange light in the sky in 1475, you probably would have thought that it was a lantern hanging from a flying witch's broom, because you would have heard of others who'd seen witches on brooms skirting the treetops. Today, you might think it was a spacecraft from another planet. And yes, as you probably very astutely guessed from the very beginning, we're headed into UFO territory. Oh, come on, stop that. Now, where were we? Oh yeah, are we getting ready to go off the deep end here? No, I'm not going to assert that there are alien ships carrying astronauts that share a similar physiology to our own despite being from another world, and I'm not going to muse on conspiratorial cover-ups or any of the usual trappings of a good X-Files episode. But I've got to admit, this story would make a really good episode. But I digress. I promise to tell you what happened to Woody that night in 1966. The whole story, even the really weird parts, of which, there are quite a few. So let's get back to it, okay? Back in the late 1960s, when he was still happily married, Woody's wife, Catherine, reportedly once said that she'd like to get Joe Pine by the neck. Joe Pine's late-night talk show was a favorite of hers, and she's said to have watched it religiously.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Joe Pine, and this program is presented to you in living, blushing color. This way you can more readily identify the blood.
Pine's guests were often from unusual walks of life, with fantastic stories. And although Catherine loved to hear fantastic stories, the Joe Pine Show was an exploitation talk show. And Joe Pine, she felt, was always deriding and browbeating his guests. Pine's show was unapologetically seedy, and, at times, profited off of judging others and encouraging its viewership to do the same, as it paraded its guests in front of them, who were, honestly, probably just trying to get a much-needed paycheck in exchange for their stories. Through 21st century eyes, it's about the most cringy thing you can imagine.
All right, you've said you're a lesbian, a prostitute, and an alcoholic.
Yes, sir, I am.
I gather you feel, then, that you need help for all three.
Well, mostly my alcoholism and my prostitution. Yes, I believe I'm mentally ill.
What about lesbianism? Isn't that an illness in your opinion?
I believe it is an illness, but I believe also that I've gone so far, and I'm 31 years of age, that it would be really useless because psychiatric help would take so long that most of my adult life would have been spent.
And if that didn't tell you everything you need to know, let's not forget about this little gem.
I think most women, even women like you who won't admit it, long to be dominated. In their secret hearts, they want to be.
Yeah, you get the idea. And the Joe Pine Show also had guests who claimed to have seen the paranormal, even UFOs, a subject that was becoming quite the hot topic in West Virginia as sightings increased. The show had even featured a story about the fabled Mothman that had been terrorizing the residents of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The story of the red-eyed creature was immortalized in pop culture when John Keel used its name for the title of his book, The Mothman Prophecies, which chronicles the bizarre happenings in West Virginia during the late 1960s. And tales of the nefarious Mothman appeared in West Virginia almost simultaneously with sightings of strange flying lights in the night sky that left some eyewitnesses with radiation burns and conjunctivitis. So, when the stories began to hit the Joe Pine Show, people naturally tuned in.
This hard-to-believe tale is about the Mothman of West Virginia. He's supposed to look like a big bird, has huge red eyes, an 8-foot wing spread. And get this, he loves to chase cars down the highways at 80 or 90 miles per hour.
According to writer Gray Barker, Woody, like his wife, didn't care for Joe Pine himself. And at the time of his bizarre encounter, Woody is said to have recalled seeing an episode of the show in which a guest claimed to have met occupants of a spacecraft who took him on a trip from his home in California to Venus. Naturally. But when Woody was asked about the show on WTAP-TV during his interview on November the 3rd of 1966, Woody said that he hadn't heard of the show.
Have you ever heard of Joe Pine?
No, I haven't. I don't believe I have.
All right. On one of his recent broadcasts, he talked with a man. He interviewed a man who had not only had somewhat similar experience to what you had last evening, but this gentleman went one step further, and he had been taken aboard a spaceship, which, by the way, was described quite similarly to what you described this particular ship. And this ship, with these people who looked like we do and so forth, took him to Venus and took him to Mars and brought him back home again.
Now, this inconsistency, as you've probably guessed, doesn't exactly bode well for the rest of the story. And it's an inconsistency that, frankly, I've never seen anyone ever bring up. And this story has been told numerous times, but each time I've heard it, it's been glaringly incomplete. I've had to reference several sources to piece together the most complete version that I could. This story is kind of a deep dive, but I think I've got a reasonably complete version to relate to you. As they say, any story worth telling is worth telling right. And that's what I intend to do. So, without further delay, let's get down to brass tacks. On Wednesday, November the 2nd of 1966, at 7:25 p.m., Woodrow Derenberger was making his way home from a long, hard day on the road. And it had been a pretty good day. In his pocket, he had a signed order for a color TV set, a $500 stereo, and some other appliances that he'd sold that day. Before he'd gotten back on the road, he picked up the phone to let Catherine know the good news, and that he was on his way home. Catherine congratulated him and told him that he was a masterful salesman, and Woody planned on treating his family to dinner at a restaurant in order to celebrate his good day. It seemed as though nothing could possibly ruin a day like today. And of course, as fate would have it, as Woody was driving home, he heard a sudden crash come from behind him. As I'm sure you remember, the weather was freezing cold, and it was raining. Accidents on the road seemed almost inevitable, but the sound Woody had heard didn't come from the road. It was in the van with him. So, he turned on the interior light and looked over his shoulder at the back of the van. A sewing machine had slid off of a stereo and tumbled down to the floor, but thankfully, there didn't seem to be any visible damage. The rainy weather had made visibility through the windshield sketchy to say the least, and Woody was eager to get home. He soon passed a speed limit marker indicating 70 miles per hour. And filled with confidence from the successes of the day, he put just a little more weight down on the accelerator. Getting up to the speed limit in the Ford Econovan could be a little uncomfortable. The wheels hadn't been aligned very well, and picking up speed while hauling so much weight made the van shake and shudder on the road. But tonight, it seemed like the stars had aligned, and the van had gotten up to speed with only the most minor of complaints. Now, picking up speed on the open highway was risky business. Nasty weather aside, speed traps weren't at all uncommon. But Woody told himself they can't get you for going just 5 miles over the limit. And besides, there didn't seem to be any other cars on the road. Everything was wide open. Desolate almost. That is, until Woody approached the exit for Route 77 to Glenville, when what appeared to be a 1952 Ford with the trim removed passed Woody's Econovan doing 80 or maybe even 90 miles per hour. Those crazy teenagers, Woody thought to himself. They'd best be careful or somebody'll be scraping them off the street. And then it occurred to Woody, as bad as visibility was that night, that car could have been anyone. Heck, it could have even been a cop car. And a small drop of ice water shot through his veins. He had a perfect driving record, and he depended on that for his job. The last thing he needed was a ticket to dampen his day. So he eased off of the accelerator a little. And suddenly, he saw another car coming up behind him in his rearview mirror. Maybe his luck had run out, and this was the cop car that he'd been so afraid of. But strangely, the car didn't have any lights on. This wasn't the first or last time that the police had used stealth to catch up with speeders. But why Woody? Why not that 1952 Ford that was going 20 miles over the speed limit? Woody expected that at any moment, he'd see red and blue lights begin to spin in the rearview mirror. But that's not at all what happened. Woody said that the vehicle coming up behind him suddenly rose into the air. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Oh, come on. I don't buy that for a second. It rose into the air? Look, this is the story. You've come this far with me on this journey, so let's just see it through, okay? Just hold your sighs of derision for a few more minutes, and then you can scoff all you like, okay? Anyway. So this vehicle behind him leapfrogged over his van and then turned 45 degrees, so that its 25 to 30-foot length was now blocking 2 lanes of traffic on the 4-lane freeway that was stretching out in front of Woody. And the thing looked like an oil lamp chimney, round in the center and flared at both ends. It was slate gray because, you know, when do we ever have spacecrafts come in designer colors in these stories? Mary Kay just ain't giving out pink space cruisers, I'm sad to say. And unlike a lot of these stories, there were no lights coming from this thing. None. And it's said to have hovered 8 to 10 inches off of the ground when it came to a complete stop, not too far in front of Woody's van. So, naturally, Woody did what everyone learns to do in driver's ed when confronted with a UFO. He hit the brake. The force of his brakes on the icy road almost caused the van to drift into the lane on his left. But thankfully, the van was able to come to a complete stop before hitting the object that blocked the road. Because, you know, I'm sure most insurance companies won't honor a claim on a collision with a giant oil lantern, much less a floating one. Unsure of what to do, Woody pulled his van onto the shoulder of the road. Now, you're probably thinking this is all really convenient. A UFO on an isolated road where no one else could see it. But, if you remember, 2 others reported it to the police that night, and at least one of those guys told his story to John Keel, aka the Discount Devil. And if this were a movie, Woody would have been sitting in his car, all alone, in the dark, with this thing hovering in front of him. But, according to his story, there was a car approaching up ahead, from around a bend in the road. Maybe they'd see what was happening, and call someone, anyone, who would do, I don't know, something. Whatever, someone does in situations like these. But as the driver rounded the curve in the road, their lights veered away from the oil lantern, and they didn't seem to have any kind of reaction at all to the oversized floating sideshow happening in the opposite two lanes. Now, that hypothetical movie scene I mentioned where everything goes down the way you expect it to, well, we're officially there now. But no UFO would be complete in a movie without a pilot. So, as you would expect, a door opened on the left side of the floating oil lamp. Now, you're probably imagining a door with its hinge on the bottom, so that it doubles as a dramatic ramp for a silhouetted figure who descends out of a blinding light. Or maybe there'd be a gull-wing door to make it look extra cool. But according to Woody, it was just like a regular old car door that opened on its side. There was no bright light show that spilled out onto the road. The only thing to exit the door was a very ordinary-looking man. Now, you're probably thinking, that's it? Something cooler than that had to happen, right? Well, it just so happens that it did. Just as the very ordinary man stepped out of the very not ordinary-looking giant oil lantern, the door closed behind him, and the oil lantern lifted up into the air. Hey, and you thought the club was a great automotive security device. As the man stepped into Woody's headlights, Woody got a better look at him, and he was a very ordinary-looking stranger. The same one I described before. Just under 6 feet tall, with a tanned complexion and slicked-back dark hair. He wore a navy blue overcoat, and underneath, Woody could see a green, shiny metallic-looking shirt that matched the man's shiny trousers. Because hey, you can't be a spaceman in the 1960s without a shiny jumpsuit. It just isn't done, Now, the shiny jumpsuit should tell you everything you need to know about this guy's character. He's a total showboat. And what he did next proves my point perfectly. The man gave Woody the mental suggestion that he'd like to talk with him, and let him know that he should roll down his passenger side window. Yeah, that's right. He used telepathy, which seems almost a little rude if I'm honest. You don't walk into a Burger King in Yucatan and try to order in English. Sure, there's a chance that the good people working there might understand you just fine, but talk about being presumptuous. Even if your Spanish is less than functional, you've got to at least try. But no, not this guy. He's going to lead with his own tone-deaf, somewhat predictable sci-fi movie guy speak. So telepathy it is. Woody remembered from being a child in Sunday school that God was said to speak in a still, soft voice. And although Woody didn't believe that this guy was God, maybe there was something to the connection that his mind had made. Maybe this guy was God adjacent, or something. Whatever the case, Woody seemed to find him somewhat comforting. But the stranger also somehow seemed authoritative and strangely concerned, like a highway patrol officer who had stopped him to check on a taillight being out, or to warn him of a road hazard up ahead. And as is usually the case with a routine traffic stop, Woody was a little freaked out. And since this guy was driving around in a lamp from yesteryear, and he's not a big blue genie voiced by the late great Robin Williams, I would imagine that Woody's feeling of alarm was just a little bit extra than usual. Woody rolled down his passenger side window, as the man had suggested, and the stranger approached the open window and peered in at Woody with his piercing eyes. And just to show that he meant no harm, the shiny-clad man grinned widely, crossed his arms, and tucked his fingers under his armpits, as we all tend to do when we meet someone new. He asked Woody why he was afraid, and assured him that he shouldn't be, and he said that his country was not as powerful as Woody's was. And yes, I said country, not planet, country. And it's interesting that he used the word country, because if this guy was trying to pose as a random Earth guy, the flying oil lamp and the wanton use of telepathy might just be considered to be dead giveaways. And stepping out of a flying oil lantern and asking someone why he's afraid, come on. It's like opening up a stranger's front door and then asking them why they're not glad to see you. But I digress. I'm not sure Woody dignified his question with an answer, or even knew how, since telepathy probably wasn't high on his list of foreign languages to tackle. And the stranger seemed to immediately realize this. "You can talk to me two ways," the stranger said. "You can say the words you wish to speak to me, or you can merely think them. I will understand you." So again, my comparison to a tourist at a Mexican Burger King still stands. Read the room, man. The stranger assured Woody that he only wished him happiness and that he meant him no harm. And just to check in with you, this is a weirdo that landed a fiendish gray monolith on the freeway and made Woody slam on his brakes on an icy road. So, hey buddy, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not buying it. Now, it may be worth mentioning that the word happiness had suggested synonyms when it was spoken aloud in Woody's mind. Those being peace and, strangely, ecstasy. So, hey, I get it. I've fantasized about a good-looking spaceman saying something similar to me too, but without the almost killing me on the open highway part. Woody had been so transfixed by the stranger looking in at him through the passenger side window that he hadn't noticed until now that cars were passing them on the other side of the freeway. So, you might wonder why any one of those passersby didn't stop to take a look at the giant oil lantern that was now hovering 75 feet in the air over the opposite side of the freeway. But, as I said before, freezing rain meant low visibility, and there was no light coming from this thing. And roads in rural West Virginia weren't well lit in the late 1960s. Not even freeways. So, even if there were streetlights that I'm unaware of, 75 feet is well above the height of an average streetlight. So spotting this thing on a dark, rainy evening would have been no small feat. So I'm not sure that any of those passersby would have noticed anything out of the ordinary at all. Just an ordinary van and an ordinary pedestrian in an overcoat and shiny pajamas. The stranger asked Woody for his name, so Woody gave him his name, and the stranger replied that he was cold. Not to say that he felt cold, although most anyone would while standing in the freezing rain. No, this guy's name, he said, was Cold. And Cold turned his head toward the lights coming from the city of Parkersburg, and Woody got the sense that the man was somehow pointing at it, though he never stretched out his arm or lifted a finger. Woody told him that that place was a city. Cold asked him if most people lived there, and Woody explained that people did, but it was mostly a place for conducting business. And Cold responded that such places where he was from were called gatherings. Now, I'm not sure why telepathy would necessitate very precise words in English, especially when peace is synonymous with ecstasy, but this is the story. And I just want to point out that this discount genie from beyond the pale apparently knows that a driver's side window can be lowered, but he doesn't know what a city is. I don't quite know how to reconcile this in my mind, but I digress. It was cold, not the guy, the weather, and it was dark, and Woody, understandably, was afraid. "Why are you frightened of us?" Cold insisted to know. "We are the same as you. We eat, we breathe, we sleep, and we bleed, even as you do. We are like you. Please do not be frightened." Seriously, this guy is bringing up blood? Nothing says trust me like bringing up blood with a stranger you've stopped on the road and then asking them not to be frightened. And what's up with him saying we when he seems to be alone? Did this guy have some other genie buddies back in the oil lantern? Was it some kind of intergalactic RV that allowed him to take his family on a much-needed trip? I mean no insult to West Virginia, but it's not most people's first choice of vacation spots. Maybe Cold is just insecure in his masculinity, and he doesn't want to ask another man for directions. So he's just making polite conversation and covertly trying to get his bearings by asking what city is ahead. Honestly, his skills in the area of making small talk seem a little unpolished. Cold asked Woody how he spent his days, and Woody replied that he was a salesman. Cold said that where he is from, he is a searcher, not to be confused with the 1960s British invasion band that sang Love Potion No. 9. At least, I don't think, anyway. Cole told Woody to report the encounter to the authorities, promising to come forward at a later date to confirm it. Now, whatever Cole wanted out of this exchange, I guess he must have gotten it by this point, or at least decided that the conversation wasn't going anywhere, because he abruptly ended it, remarking simply, "We will see you again." As Cole stepped away from Woody's Ford Econovan, the oil lantern descended down onto the road again. But it had turned 45 degrees, again, and was facing endwise now, so as not to block any additional lanes of traffic this time. And Cole hurried back to the vehicle, and in the most mundane way possible, Cole opened the door, just like it was a car door, and Woody could see someone inside the vehicle helping Cole in, before the door closed with the very familiar sound of an automotive door closing. When the craft hovered upward, Woody said it made a kind of fluttering noise like an idling helicopter. And as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Woody rolled up the passenger side window and continued on his way home to Mineral Wells. According to Woody's daughter, Tanya, after Catherine's call to the police that evening, she witnessed, while watching quietly from the top of their home stairwell at the age of only 4 years old, the arrival of uniformed authorities who came there to speak with Woody and get a statement about his experience. And approximately 30 minutes after they had left, Woody was visited by 3 men dressed in black suits, all wearing fedoras and sunglasses, despite the late hour of the night. They were what John Keel and Gray Barker would famously call the MIB, the Men in Black. Stories of the mysterious Men in Black weren't at all uncommon in West Virginia in the 1960s, but I'm not sure that anyone thought of them as secret government agents with slick sci-fi gadgets. And I think we probably have the X-Files and the Barry Sonnenfeld movies to thank for that stereotype. The Men in Black that were often reported in the 1960s were just plain weird. They were said to have had somewhat of a golden complexion, not unlike that of Mr. Cole's, and they were said to be unduly tall, with long tapering fingers that they kept hidden beneath gloves. And despite their golden complexion, which some described as looking vaguely Korean, or maybe even like that of a Spaniard, John Keel famously called them the cadaverous men, because they were often said to be odd, pale, and clammy, and were described as though they looked barely even alive. The Men in Black were often said to smell of mildew, and they wore ill-fitting suits that were oddly thin and not conducive to the cold weather in which they sometimes appeared. And the stories about them don't really portray them as overly scary or menacing, just odd. They were said to speak in a strange sing-song kind of way, almost like what would have been heard from computers in later years. There's a famous story of one who walked into a West Virginia diner, unsure of how to order. A waitress had to show him how to spear the meat with a fork and cut it with a knife, and he was later vexed by a bowl of gelatin, unsure of how to eat it. There's even a story of one of them eating a cigarette. Just as gremlins had been the mischief makers of the 1940s, the Men in Black were the mysterious troublemakers of the 1960s. But unlike gremlins, the Men in Black seemed kind of inept. They would arrive at people's homes unannounced, sometimes claiming inheritances or prizes had been won, just so they could collect personal information. One such visitor warned in advance that he'd need a glass of water very shortly after his arrival. And weirdly, he had a green wire running up his pant leg from out of his sock. After about 10 minutes of talking, his complexion turned bright red, and he reminded those that he'd called on that he was in need of that glass of water now. There are, of course, the more sinister stories of the Men in Black making feeble attempts at kidnapping, though I'm not aware of any of them having been successful. Far more common are the stories of them just trying to half-heartedly make demands that they couldn't enforce. Journalist Mary Heyer recalled an instance in which 3 such characters, and to be clear, they usually came in packs of 3, wandering into her office and asking her what she would do if someone told her to stop printing stories about UFOs. She replied very plainly that she would tell them to go to hell. The 3 strangers looked at each other uneasily and then despondently walked out of the office again, Many of those who had reported seeing UFOs also reported such encounters with strange, cadaverous men in black. And according to Woody's daughter Tanya, Woody's experience with them was much the same. They asked him not to tell anyone about his experience, which of course he already had. So they unfortunately weren't very capable as paranormal first responders, but they still insisted that he do so. And immediately after they left, Tanya said that Woody looked at Catherine and said, "Yeah, right." Now, this event seems to have been omitted from the book that Woody wrote along with Harold W. Hubbard in 1971 called Visitors from Lanulos, though perhaps not. Woody remarked a few times about NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which was active in the United States from 1956 to 1980. And NICAP reportedly asked Woody to keep the story to himself. Could NICAP have shown up at Woody's door that night in full Blues Brothers cosplay? And why were there so many reports of these strange, otherworldly men in black during the 1960s? The prevailing rumor was that they themselves seemed to be alien somehow. But it seems equally likely that any unusual group of foreign men in suits at this time could have served as the unintentional inspiration for one of these folk tales, especially when West Virginia seemed to be rife with so many paranormal occurrences. But, like Woody's story, the lack of cinematic flair and the off-putting mundanity of the men in black made them seem all the more authentic to people. Like modern-day fairies here to spirit people away or warn them about wandering too far into the wilderness. Many of these stories, like Woody's meeting with Mr. Cold, seems to have, at least maybe, been based on a kernel of truth. A stranded John Keel had become the devil in the memory of some religious residents of West Virginia. And maybe, just maybe, Woodrow Derenberger saw something that he contextualized in the only way he knew how, like a UFO story from the late-night Joe Pine show. But, if you recall, Woody wasn't the only one to have reported the incident that night. Only minutes after Woody watched the flying oil lamp depart, Mrs. Frank Huggins and her 2 children had reportedly stopped their own car just to watch it fly over the freeway. Another man said the object had scared him out of his wits when it passed over his car and flashed a powerful blinding light on him. So, naturally, there are those who believe Woody's story was, in some way, partially true. Maybe up until this point, anyway. Woody seems to have believed, in earnest, that he met Mr. Colt. And if it hadn't been for the outrageous telepathy claim, I might even have thought so too. There were so many maybes. Maybe Woody fell asleep for the briefest of moments on the road and had a dream. Or maybe he made it all up. After the incident, Woody had an electroencephalogram to determine whether or not he had lied about it. And the results came back clean. Some say that EEGs are more reliable than polygraph examinations, but neither are 100% reliable, of course. It looks as though Woody really believed the story he told. And, as I said before, he wasn't the only one to have reported such an incident to the police. Now, I think it's worth revisiting all of the misfortune that befell Woody as a result of having told this story. The crowds of curious people showing up at his house, UFO nuts toting guns hoping to bag themselves a spaceman, and even Woody's eventual divorce. Whether or not Woody's story so far is at all true, what comes next, I feel, most certainly isn't. But a man who's lost most everything just doesn't have much to lose anymore. And I really wonder if Woody was feeling down one night and whispered the now famous words of Jack Skellington into the night air.
Well, I may as well give them what they want.
The majority of the book, Visitors from Lanulos, deals with Derenberger's relationship with his newfound extraterrestrial friends, who are revealed to be from the faraway planet of Lanulos, in the galaxy of Ganymede. And since there are no galaxies named after Jupiter's moons, Derenberger would later assert that this was an intentional misdirection, meant for safety's sake. I mean, you wouldn't want any nosy Earth astronauts to make the short commute to another planet after all. Cold would eventually be revealed to be a surname, and his given name was Indrid. And Indrid Cold would make visits to the Derenberger's porch along with his Lanulosian companion, Carl Ardo. I would like to believe that spacemen aren't called Carl, but I've met so few spacemen in my life. Too few spacemen, in fact. And Woody would even be able to travel to their planet, where an agrarian society of nudists lived with their families and traveled on flying sleds. They, of course, were religious people who, like so many West Virginians, were strictly monotheistic. And they even shared West Virginia's affinity for meat and potatoes. They had bunk beds and even CB radios. The similarities we have to our nude space brethren just seems to know no bounds. They had no war or suffering, of course, and they believed that we wouldn't either if we only learned to communicate telepathically. And if they had a planetary anthem, I'm sure that it was probably Kumbaya. With his friends Indrid Cold and Carl Ardo, Woody would gain insider knowledge of the solar system that astronomers could only dream of. For example, who knew that the entire planet of Saturn is actually shaped like a huge bowl, with people living inside of it, like in a valley? And the rim of this so-called bowl is covered with ice, like a kind of giant margarita glass rimmed with salt. And the rings of Saturn are simply rainbows that are caused by the sun shining on the ice. How's that for science, huh? And Woody would learn the intergalactic alphabet on Lanulos as well, which curiously has a symbol coinciding with each and every letter of the Roman alphabet used in English. No more, no less. Isn't that something? Now, if you suspended your disbelief just for the sake of good manners while I entertain the wilder parts of this story, I completely sympathize if you feel you've been sold a false bill of goods somehow. These stories really seem like they were cooked up to stretch out Woody's original tale for the sake of selling copies of his book. And speaking of his book, with all these impossible tales found in Visitors from Lanulos, one is sorely missing from the book: the story of the vial of medicine that Indrid Cold brought to Woody on his porch. A vial of medicine that I remember dreaming about so many nights back in 2009, after my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Around the time that my mom received her diagnosis, I started reading John Keel's books, and Gray Barker's as well. And although there were much wilder and far more fantastic stories to be found in them than just Derenberger's, there was part of Woody's story that really captured my imagination. The vial of medicine that Indrid Cold gave him for his stomach ulcer, which I neglected to mention earlier, magically cured his stomach in an instant. A magic fairy potion from another world. And while there really wasn't any part of me that believed it ever really existed, at least not as the magical potion that it had been described to be, I, like Fox Mulder, wanted to believe. Woodrow Derenberger passed away in 1990, but his daughter, Tanya Bauman, started a Yahoo group for her father in the early 2000s. I joined, and was really kind of excited when she was kind enough to reply to me. And one of the big draws to this group was the chance to purchase an out-of-print manuscript of the 1971 book by Woody and Harold W. Hubbard, Visitors from Lanulos, which was an account of Woody's story about his experiences. This book is exceptionally rare and went out of print very shortly after its first printing. I haven't checked on the prices for an original edition in years, but back in 2009, it cost between $400 and $500 US, with copies in impeccable shape commanding even higher prices. It's a really beloved story. It's even said that Muhammad Ali took a copy of the book to the ring for years as a good luck charm. How's that for an endorsement? But wait, the superfans out there are doubtlessly saying. The book went back into print in 2014. You can buy it right now. That means that it's not missing media and probably doesn't belong on this podcast. But the edition that you can buy today is not the same as the first edition. The original book has been edited for a couple of reasons. The first is to withhold the names of Woody's relatives who didn't want to be included. And considering the absolute mayhem that all of this unleashed on Woody's family, it's definitely an understandable choice. The second reason is that the newest release has been quote-unquote augmented by Woody's daughter Tanya and the book's publisher. I'm not entirely sure what augmented means in this case, but rest assured, the book has changed. But in all fairness, the original book was incomplete as well. According to John Keel, Woody's co-author, Harold W. Hubbard, edited out some of the most intriguing information. I'm not sure what that information would have been, but one of the most notable absences in both versions of the book that I've read is the omission of Woody's story about receiving a vial of medicine for his stomach ulcer. Or maybe I should just call it what it is, a magic panacea that made him instantly well. This story does appear in John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, and also Gray Barker's book, The Silver Bridge. Now, as you've probably suspected, I joined Tanya Bauman's Yahoo group to ask about this very story. What happened to the vial? Even if it was now empty, where was the container? Well, I asked, and her response was simply, I don't know. My dad never mentioned it. I was so disappointed. Not disappointed with Tanya for graciously answering my message, just disappointed that this object that I wanted so desperately to exist was not in her possession, and by extension, very probably not real. Now, if someone gave you a vial of magic potion, it's not an object you'd be likely to misplace. You'd keep it close at hand, and probably show it to your kids. Maybe even put it in an extra safe place somewhere. Hey, if anything ever happens to me, you should know this container is for a cure-all from another world, so you might want to hang on to it. Even if it was empty, you'd still never discard a memento from another world. What did it look like? What was it made of? But even if it had ever existed, and Tanya somehow still had it, what was I going to say anyway? Hey, I know I'm a random stranger from the internet, but do you think I could borrow it and try to cure my mother's cancer? I'll totally send you a Chili's gift card. I never did get my hands on that very probably imaginary magic vial, but I did buy a manuscript copy of Visitors from Lanulos from Tanya, and I still have it to this day. Visitors from Lanulos may not really be about stories from another world, but it is about stories from another time. Books about the paranormal happenings of the 1960s in West Virginia were quite the hot topic in the 1970s. Gray Barker had certainly found fame in writing them, and he'd had kind words spoken about him by the likes of John Lennon, David Bowie, and even Leonard Nimoy. And I'll have more to say about TV's Mr. Spock in just a bit. Woodrow Derenberger wasn't a wealthy man, and telling his story had cost him his job. Whatever happened to him on November the 2nd of 1966, I've always wondered if he cooked up his later outer space adventures just to sell a few books and recoup his losses. Writing Visitors from Lanulos may have seemed like a good way to capitalize off the growing UFO fever at the time and the fear that had been circulating amidst West Virginia's residents, who'd had strange experiences that left them feeling afraid. TVs and telephone signals would be periodically taken over by men's voices droning out meaningless numbers, which has never been explained. People saw unexplained lights that left them with what can only be described as radiation burns. And some even saw the infamous, potentially headless, red-eyed Mothman figure, who some have suspected may have been nothing more than an albino turkey vulture or a sandhill crane nesting in the area. And paperback vendors and salacious talk show hosts hope to profit from people's fear. And honestly, that's not a trend that's ever really gone away. During the late 1990s, rumors about the potential for computer problems in the year 2000 led to the infamous Y2K scare. And while you're probably thinking that this runaway piece of folklore didn't have anything to do with a spaceman, would you believe that Leonard Nimoy was on a VHS release of a documentary meant to help people weather the coming Y2K storm?
In dead of winter, at the stroke of midnight, January 1st, 2000, elevators may stop. Heat may vanish. Credit cards and ATMs may cease to function. Airplanes and trains may come to a halt. Telephones and televisions may not utter a sound. Water delivery systems may not deliver water for cooking, drinking, or bathing. Streetlights, stoplights, lights in buildings everywhere may flicker out. Hospitals, clinics, pharmacies may be unable to provide proper medical care. Banks and stock markets around the world may suffer some form of meltdown. And nuclear power plants may cease to generate the electricity we need for all aspects of our daily lives.
Yeah, people ponied up their hard-earned dollars just so Mr. Spock could tell them what to do. People were so afraid that they were predicting the collapse of civilization as we know it. Now, you may be thinking that was back in the 1990s. We've come too far to ever be duped into believing in a wild conspiracy that warns of impending societal doom. Right? Well, remember QAnon?
Hundreds of QAnon followers from across the country gathered in Dallas to witness John F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy Jr. reappear and announce that Donald Trump would be reinstated as president. They were disappointed when the assassinated president and his deceased son never showed.
QAnon was the bizarre social media conspiracy monster that prompted impressionable people to pledge an oath. Where we go one, we go all. And it asked that people follow its teachings, namely that prominent left-leaning politicians were here to harm children, and that Donald Trump would save the world. Insurrectionists and rioters who saw themselves as revolutionary citizens stormed the U.S. Capitol on January the 6th of 2021, an event which resulted in the deaths of 5 people, with injuries sustained by many more, including 174 police officers. The mayhem cost taxpayers $2.7 million in damages. More than 600 rioters were convicted of or pled guilty to assault or obstructing law enforcement officers, and 170 of using a deadly weapon. Most of them received full pardons, while 14 militia members received commuted sentences. And all of this begs the question, how do we keep letting things get so far out of hand? Back in the late 1960s, Americans who were either excited, scared, or maybe both, brought firearms to the Derenbergers' home in hopes of finding fame for being the ones to bag a spaceman. It's something that could easily have turned deadly, and thankfully, it didn't. But not all who were made to endure this type of hysteria are quite so lucky. Why do people believe in this kind of insanity? Well, simply put, because others do. The bandwagon effect, as psychologists call it, is really nothing more than the result of folklore. Folklore can help us reaffirm our values. Tall tales like Johnny Appleseed can remind us to preserve the beauty of the great outdoors. And folklore can also be used against us and make us believe that those same values are being taken away from us, just like the Capitol rioters believed in January of 2021. They made their pledge and they were committed to their cause. Now, I hope that no one ever makes any kind of pledge like that in the name of folklore ever again. After all, it wouldn't be wise to pledge an oath to Babe the Blue Ox or Johnny Appleseed and then try to overthrow a government. But if the thought of doing something like that really is so ridiculous, what prompted the January 6th rioters to believe in a satanic cabal of government officials that were secretly running a child trafficking ring? Well, child trafficking is something that, obviously, people care about very deeply, especially those whose lives have been affected by it. So pledging to stop it is a pledge that most anyone would be willing to make. And while the lore behind QAnon is just about as fictitious as it gets, child trafficking remains a very real problem in the world. So much folklore is really just fantasy built on a foundation of truth. The ridiculous Y2K scare was really based on concerns over software using 2-digit numbers to represent years, a problem that was honestly very real. The story of Johnny Appleseed was based on an actual man named John Chapman, though the iconic stories of his barefoot trek across America and seemingly spiritual connection to nature are all, of course, complete embellishments. Maybe there was a similar kernel of truth, however minuscule, in the story of Indrid Cold. There were those who would step forward in November of 1966 to confirm that they had been passers-by on the freeway that fateful night, and they'd seen Woody's van parked on the shoulder of the road, with a man standing on the passenger side peering in. And before Woody's story blew up, there were those who had made police reports of stories that were very similar to Woody's. There were even those who said that they saw the flying oil lamp that passed over the freeway. Now, I in no way intend to be an apologist for tall tales. And so many tales in America have originated from those who saw something that they couldn't explain, and were understandably afraid. Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, Chupacabra, the Ozark Howler, and of course, even Mothman. These may all have been just the product of some very fearful imaginations. And if others believe in it, it becomes easier to convince yourself that it's all real. Fear causes people to entertain some pretty strange ideas. I may not have ever completely believed in Indrid Cold, but back in 2009, I can't tell you how many times I wished that he would land his flying kerosene lantern in front of my car some dark, rainy night on the freeway and give me a magic vial of medicine that would cure my mom's cancer. And maybe if just a little drop of it worked, I could bring the rest of it to the oncologist's waiting room for all the patients to drink. If you ask most people what they would want their superpower to be, they usually say they want to fly or talk with animals. But this is still the superpower I dream of: having a magic potion that cures cancer. My mom passed away back in 2011, and I'm only 8 years younger than she was when she died. A fact that still keeps me up at night sometimes. But in a weird way, during the 2 years that she suffered the most horrific pain that I've ever seen, the story of Woodrow Derenberger kept me sane. If only just a little. And that's what folklore is meant to do. So tell your kids about Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill if you like. Tell them Santa brings toys, the Easter Bunny brings chocolate, and Indrid Cold brings medicine from the stars that will instantly make you feel all better. And if they ask you if any of those stories are true, tell them that maybe once there was a small seed of truth somewhere that grew into a tall tale. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time. Bye.